Welcome, everyone, to this, the first lecture in a series titled The Dawn of Thought. The Dawn of Thought, Plato and His Legacy. You may think that that phrase, the dawn of thought, is a bit grand. Did thought begin? And could it begin with just one man? Well, let me explain a little bit why I think that phrase is appropriate for this series. There was a great German philosopher called Karl Jaspers. He coined this phrase about 100 years ago, called the axial age. And he noted that in the period from roughly the 8th century BC through to the 3rd century BC, in China, in Iran, in Palestine, and in Greece, there emerged almost simultaneously an extraordinary appetite for understanding fundamental reality and for reflecting in incredibly sophisticated ways about reality. So in China, we have the figure of Confucius emerging, of Lao Tzu, of Mo Tzu. In India, we have the great quickening of the Vedic tradition from the ritualistic into the philosophical, with the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita. In Iran, the birth of Zoroastrianism, very complex theories about the cosmos and the place of human beings within the cosmos. In Palestine, the great prophetic tradition from Elijah through to Jeremiah to Isaiah emerges, especially intensifying in the 6th centuries, 5th centuries BC. And of course, finally, in Greece, in Europe, the only European region of all of those, for all of those civilizations. In Greece, we see the emergence in the 6th and 5th centuries of an extraordinary range of avenues of human inquiry. In this short, brilliant golden age, centered around Athens, we see the birth of democracy, albeit not in a form we may be used to today. We see the birth of drama. No one had thought to do theater before. The birth of drama, the birth of tragedy in the 490s, 480s, 470s. And the birth of history with the figure of Herodotus and Thucydides, the birth of anthropology in Herodotus. Herodotus is obsessively interested not just in history, but in people, different customs and practices and so on. Thucydides is not just a historian, he's also an economist. We see with the great figure of Aristotle in the 4th century, the birth of psychology. No one had thought to think about what is the mind, what makes us tick psychologically. We see the birth of botany, of biology, of physics, of meteorology, all in one place, one tiny city-state, numbering 10 to 15, maybe 20,000 citizens at most, supported by an enormous infrastructure of human slavery. And this is what largely permitted these brilliant minds to take leisure. The Greek word for leisure is scholar. To be a scholar is to be somebody who has the leisure to explore these questions. So we have this extraordinary fizz in the development of humanity, this extraordinary ferment, this kind of explosive intellectual phase in the history of humanity in that short period, intensifying in Greece. So why Plato? Why are we going to be spending the next 6 lectures focusing on this one man? We're going to be doing it because no other single figure, or so I'm going to argue, distills as powerfully all of the different ideas that are emerging in that half-millennium period all across those different regions. Nobody else applies the same power of scrutiny, the same sophistication to these different questions. One of your great thinkers, Ralph Waldo Emerson, once said, "Plato is philosophy, and philosophy is Plato." That's not an exaggeration. One of my countrymen, Alfred North Whitehead, who migrated to the United States, spent a lot of his time in Harvard, once wrote that the safest general characterization of European philosophy is that it consists in a series of footnotes to Plato. Footnotes to Plato. 2,500 years of human thought, arguably the best human thought, certainly in the West, but also of incalculable influence elsewhere too, in this one figure. Many might think that's a bit of an exaggeration, and Whitehead was careful. He said, "I don't mean that everyone just took on Plato's systems and ideas, but that if you really went through a history of Western philosophy, you see his fingerprints everywhere. You'll see his fingerprints everywhere. Sometimes you'll see them most clearly in the philosophers who can't stand him. And we often see that in the development of human thought. Influence can be negative as well as positive. Nietzsche couldn't stand Plato for reasons we'll come on to in lecture 5. And so he couldn't stop writing about him. So we're all, as it were, living in Plato's shadow. And so what I hope to do in the next 6 lectures is not just to introduce you to Plato, but to give you a compressed introduction to philosophy, to all of philosophy. And I hope in the next 6 hours, 6 lectures, we're not actually going to leave out any significant aspect in a 3-year standard philosophy program at an Ivy League university, or even better, Oxford or Cambridge. We'll be looking at all of these different aspects. We'll be looking at the nature of fundamental reality. That sounds a little bit strange. I'll hope to demystify that. Now, some of you here may not even quite know what the word philosophy is supposed to mean. Walking through an airport yesterday and seeing the philosophy section, a lot of the books there would be what you might call self-help. That is to say, the idea there is that philosophy is the code that you live by, maybe. The code that you live by. I don't want to belittle that way of thinking about philosophy, and I hope that by the end of these lectures, you will actually have a very good understanding of what it might mean to select a code and to understand your place in the world. But that's not where we're going to begin. We're not going to be beginning with just the self. We're going to be zooming in. We're going to be, first of all, we're going to start from the widest lens we can, and then we're going to zoom right into the place of human beings in the world and what human flourishing and human happiness might consist in. So, what is philosophy? It's exploring fundamental reality. Now, what is fundamental reality? What could we even mean by that phrase? Well, it could be that it's just stuff. That's the dominant orthodoxy today. It's just matter. And because everything is matter, nothing matters. Because you're just matter, you don't matter. This philosophy, this disposition, this way of thinking, born out of the scientific revolution in the Enlightenment period, shall we say roughly 1650 to 1800? Well, let's be more precise. 1596, the birth of Descartes, to 1804, the death of Immanuel Kant. The great age of Enlightenment, so-called, the birth of rationality, the birth of science, as the textbooks like to convince us. What a strange self-congratulatory way to talk about a period, Enlightenment. What comes before 1596, if 1596 marks the beginning of the Enlightenment? Darkness, the Dark Ages. What I want to suggest is actually the Enlightenment has brought in its wake, not only illumination, but also gloom. Gloom about our place in the world and what the world is. It's brought with it, in the words of the great German sociologist Max Weber, disenchantment. Disenchantment. We feel disenchanted. Entzauberung was his phrase, his word. So we have this strange paradox. The more we come to understand about the world scientifically, and the more tempting it becomes to identify fundamental reality as just what science tells us there is, the more disenchanted and the less at ease we become in the world that we've come to understand so much better. This is the great paradox. Now, why is that? Well, the sheer success of the natural sciences has led philosophers to believe that the sciences must be onto something, or at least that what science explores and itemizes and discovers and tells us so many extraordinary things about and achieves such practical success with, must in the end be what all of reality is about. Sometimes it's called nothing buttery. Oh yes, you may think you're conscious. You may think that morality is true and out there. There is a moral universe beyond the physical universe. You may think that listening to Beethoven's Fourth Piano Concerto is somehow tasting the divine. But all of that is nothing but the natural sciences. Nothing but. Everything, all of that can be explained simply in terms of the physiology, of our neurons in the brain. Everything can be understood in reductive Darwinian terms. Plato inherits just this way of thinking about the world. And one of the movements he is trying to challenge is exactly this attempt to reduce everything down to stuff. So, in the 5th century BC, we see the emergence in Ionia, which is that part of now is the western coast of Turkey, in effect, but then was a Greek-dominated part of the world. We see the emergence of the first scientists, you might say. Somebody like Thales, who we don't have extensive works of his, we've just got to work with fragments. But it seems as if Thales was committed to the idea that all of reality was made of water. It all came down to water. Anaximenes thought, oh, well, it's all air. Everything is air. Heraclitus says everything was fire. Fire and flux and change. And that got married to another tradition, the atomist tradition of Empedocles and Democritus, saying, yes, well, whatever these ultimate units are, they're just particular little atoms. And all of reality is made up of these little atoms. That, if you like, is something very close to the kind of dominant scientific and philosophical orthodoxies with us today. Obviously, the science is a lot more complex, the theorizing is a lot more sophisticated. But that is ultimately the materialistic worldview that reduces everything down to matter, that Plato begins to turn against as he comes of age. There's another stream of thinking that he's reacting against, which also has its descendant stalking the corridors of the academy and offices and walking the streets today. And that is what we might call just relativism. Relativism. Roughly speaking, the idea that truth, that there is no capital T truth. Truth is relative to the subject. Truth is relative to the culture, to the society. There can be no hierarchy of truths. There can be no objective truths. This is the great claim of the so-called postmodernists, the post-structuralists, that truth and meaning and value are plastic, are in a state of total, complete flux, can never be pinned down. Some of the figures that Plato would have heard lecturing in Athens, in the Agora, no doubt he would have met many of them, were known by the collective term of sophists. Sophists. From the Greek word sophos, meaning wise, and sophistikos, sophistes, the wise person. And in fact, we've got a play, a comedy from Aristophanes that identifies Plato's great teacher Socrates as a sophist. And sophists were wandering lecturers who took money to train the great and the good, or the children of the great and the good, in the art of rhetoric, of speech-making. This is a time when democracy has just emerged in around about 500 BC, so the first half of the 5th century, democracy is emerging in this radical form. Everything centered on an ecclesia, an assembly of 10,000, a boulere, a kind of inner cabinet of 500, and a presidency that rotated daily. And winning over that crowd meant you needed to be good at rhetoric. You needed to be good at winning over a crowd by any means necessary. And the sophists were brilliant at training aspiring, ambitious politicians to win over the crowds, to develop and to take up a perspective that was going to work for them, to achieve their goals. Not to track truth, as Plato began to complain and Socrates began to see, but to secure power, to secure self-interest. And so, for the sophist, truth was as malleable and as flexible and as plastic as for Derrida and for Foucault and for Lyotard, the great Francophone triumvirate of postmodernism. So one of the reasons it makes sense to be spending so much time on Plato is that he counters these two great traditions that are with us still. The tradition of a reductive naturalism, kind of science worship, science as the end-all and be-all, the ultimate referee, the ultimate arbiter of what's real, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a tradition that says nothing's really real except my own thinking makes it so. Plato's great influence, of course, was Socrates. Born in 470, put on trial and executed in 399 BC. The great shock of Plato's life, and the moment at the end of this extraordinary century when Athens had been the place where all of these different avenues of human achievement that I mentioned earlier arose, and yet a place that was also a home for civil war, for genocide, for slavery, for extraordinary, genuine tragedy and human suffering and human evil. And Plato is wrestling with all of this, and he sees in the figure of Socrates something like a saint. Now, of course, we don't know a great deal more about Socrates than we find in Plato's dialogues. We have an account of him by an Athenian general, not a terribly bright or learned man, Xenophon. And we have this great caricature of him by Aristophanes in that comedy I mentioned earlier. Nevertheless, we can form an interesting view of him, even though he never wrote a word. Extraordinary to think that. One of the most influential philosophers in history never wrote a word, or at least never wrote a word that has come down to us. Jesus of Nazareth never wrote a word, but exercised incalculable influence. Homer didn't write a word. It's simply memory and oral tradition. Extraordinary thing to think about. And we'll see when we come on to discuss Plato's dialogues that there's a great suspicion about the written word. What characterizes Socrates as his personality emerges for us in the early dialogues of Plato is a restless seeking after truth. He is obsessed with finding the right answer. And that put him at odds with, and made him a great threat to, the sophistic tradition. Because he wasn't interested in power, he wasn't interested in training the great and the good to learn how to win over a political assembly. He was simply interested in how we get to understand the world and how we can say that we know something and we can defend it. If you're starting with Plato, I'd recommend starting with the Apology, Plato's Apology. It's Plato's Apology in that Plato wrote it, but there are good grounds for thinking that it represents something very close to the speech that Socrates made in his own defense at his trial in 399 BC. He's on trial for 2 charges. Charge number 1, he is introducing new gods. This is deeply destabilizing. He's introducing new gods into the city-state. Remember, this is a city-state. This is a culture, like most ancient cultures, that is tied to, oriented towards, stabilized and ordered by civic religion. This is not really a kind of philosophical religion. It's a religion of cults and common worship that stitches a society and a community together. The second charge, corrupting the youth. Corrupting the youth. Now, it's not quite clear how those charges were understood by the prosecution, but we get a good sense of why Socrates was creating this kind of criticism, was leaving himself open to these sorts of charges as we read the Apology. Here's a quick quote. Chaerephon asked the Delphic oracle, the oracle of Delphi, about 2 hours' drive northwest of Athens, the center of the world. The Greeks called it the omphalos tou kosmou, the belly button of the cosmos. And it was allegedly the source of all wisdom, but it gave its pronouncements in a famously enigmatic way. So Socrates says, Chaerephon went to ask the Delphic oracle if anyone was wiser than I. And the oracle said, no. Knowing my ignorance, I wondered what the oracle could mean. And I thought of a plan to test the reply. I went to a man with a reputation for wisdom, a statesman, a politician, so wise, hoping to be able to say, you said I was the wisest, but this statesman is wiser. But I found, in fact, that the politician was not, in fact, wise. And I was just that little bit wiser, in that at least I knew my ignorance. I tried others with the same result, and it angered them. You can feel the rage is coming through in the responses that he generates. And that made me sorry and afraid. But I had to take the oracle seriously. I couldn't just reject the oracle. So I discovered quite quickly that the people with the biggest reputations were the worst. Poets were so far from being able to explain their own poems that I could only conclude that they didn't write from knowledge, but in a divine trance, like prophets. Yet because of their poetry, they thought themselves wise in other matters too. So I decided that I had the same advantage over them as over the politicians. Lastly, I went to the craftsmen. Now, they certainly had valuable knowledge that I lacked, and in this respect, they were wiser. But they made the same mistake as the poets. Because they were good at their craft, they thought they understood the highest matters too. So I decided that I was just better off as I was, without their knowledge, but also without their kind of ignorance. The oracle was right. Socrates goes on to suggest at the end of the Apology that he shouldn't be put to death. He was given the option of exile or death. He says neither. Well, what do you think is appropriate, Socrates? I think you should put me up at public expense and allow me to dine off the state for the rest of my life. You should give me free dinners. The city of Athens should give me free dinners in the town hall, the Prytanes, for the rest of my life. Because of the wisdom I am bringing, the illumination I am bringing, in suggesting that none of these people know as much as they think they do. We see in that speech the beginnings of philosophy. Why? Because Socrates is asking very, very general questions. What is the nature of knowledge? How can we get under the skin of any subject and ask, but why? What is this? Ultimately, why? You go to a university today, you will see in the philosophy department, philosophies of almost everything. It's really the only subject that is a meta subject. There's a philosophy of religion. There's the philosophy of language. There's the philosophy of beauty, aesthetics, the philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of literature. How is that possible? Well, it's possible because of this original Socratic insight that you can ask of everything, yes, but what is it really? The poets can't tell us. The craftsmen can't tell us. The statesmen can't tell us. They've got their own disciplines. And yet, because of the success they acquire and within their own disciplines, they think they can step out of those disciplines and hold forth on questions they don't actually know anything about. Think of Hollywood celebrities being asked about inconceivably complex policy questions about, say, the environment or war or finance or economics and taxation. Or think about the contemporary cult of scientism. This idea that scientists are the great high priests of our age. A Richard Dawkins or a Neil deGrasse Tyson or a Lawrence Krauss. Well, what are they? They're brilliant biologists and cosmologists and so on. But their success in those extremely refined, sophisticated corners of the natural sciences somehow gives them a passport to holding forth on all kinds of different questions about human flourishing and about our future and so on and so forth. So this tendency, this problem that Socrates diagnoses is with us still today. What are we going to be looking at in this series? A quick overview. In this lecture, we're really looking at Plato's world, his intellectual world, the cultural world, his place in the development of human thought in the axial age. In the next lecture, we're going to be looking at the secret weapon that Socrates gives him, the technique that allows philosophy to get off the ground in such a way that we've not really been able to shake it off since. And that is dialectic, dialogue, conversation, the give and take between people who are collaborators in a common inquiry after truth. That'll be the next lecture. In lecture 3, we're going to be looking at the two great themes of Plato's work and his two greatest achievements. His account of what the world is, what ultimate reality is, whether it is just matter or whether there's something more than matter, and how we can go about getting any kind of access to that. The problem of being or ontology, as the philosophers like to say, and the problem of knowledge, or epistemology, to give it its technical term. Being and knowing. We may think we know what being is, what nature is, what supernature is or is not. But we have to have some kind of account of how we got there. So to understand being, we need to understand knowing. And from those are the two engines of Plato's thought, and they remain the two engines of philosophy as such as it's practiced today in all philosophy departments. Sometimes called M&E, metaphysics, being, the study of being, the study of ultimate being, and E, epistemology, theory of knowledge, how we come to perceive the world and how we come to know the world. So that's lecture 3, and then we're going to move on to, in lecture 4, to look at Plato on politics, the philosophy of politics, political philosophy. And part of Plato's genius is that he shows us how understanding being, understanding knowledge, also involves coming to understand the good. And that only once we can come to understand the good can we even begin to ask, how should we order ourselves as a person? How should we order our souls? What is a soul? And how can we possibly organize a community of souls? How do we structure it? And we'll see in that lecture that Plato irritates everyone. He irritates the right because he's got some very radical left proposals about the role of the state in particular. And he would infuriate the left, certainly, because of his commitment to hierarchy within a community, his profound suspicion of democracy as the right tool to deliver justice and harmony and social order. So we're going to have fun in that lecture. And the 5th lecture, we're going to be looking at Plato's afterlives. This is going to be a challenging lecture because we're going to be looking at, really in lecture 5 and lecture 6, you can think of that final third as looking at the theme of from Plato to NATO. And maybe also mischievously, given the context, from Plato to Peterson. And I'll be saying a little bit about why I've been trying to persuade Dr. Peterson to be more Platonic. And we'll have a look at, right at the end, look at a comparison of Jung and Plato, amongst others. But anyway, in that lecture 5, so the first half of that final third of the series, we'll be really looking at the impact of Plato and the Platonic schools all the way through the Hellenistic age, up through into the early years of Christianity, that extraordinary fusion of the Hebraic and the Hellenic in Philo of Alexandria, and the great impact that fusion has on East and West. We'll be looking at Augustine. We'll be looking at, in the 4th and 5th centuries, we'll be looking at Boethius in the 5th and 6th centuries. We'll be looking at Anselm and Aquinas in the 12th and 13th centuries. And we'll be looking at Plato's rebirth in Florence in the Renaissance in the 1480s, with the great figures of Marsilio Ficino and Pico della Mirandola. And then in the final lecture, we'll be looking at the theme of Plato today, and how his ideas persist. in every area of philosophy, including in the modern university. Even in my own university, the University of Cambridge, which is a university that has been historically, at least in the last 100, 150 years, extremely skeptical of Plato's impact. But he, as somebody said of metaphysics itself, one could say of Plato that he always buries his undertakers. He always buries his undertakers. He's had many great critics over the last 2,500 years, but he's outlived all of them. So, to come into land today, we've looked at Plato's world. We've looked a little bit at the question of why Plato? Why are we thinking about this figure? What we haven't looked at is the problem of which Plato. There are many different Platos, and this is a challenge that we're going to be focusing on in particular in the next lecture. The challenge is that just as Socrates never wrote a word, Plato never wrote a word either. What do I mean by that? Well, Plato wrote dialogues, not treatises, not long speeches or long lectures. He gave lectures, we don't have any of them. All he wrote were dialogues. But he's never in any of the dialogues. Well, in one dialogue, one of the characters says that he's present. That's in the Apology. Yeah, Plato's there. And in one other dialogue, the Phaedo, which describes the scene immediately after the trial of Socrates, where Socrates is taking the hemlock, amazing meditation, as he's taking the hemlock and slowly dying and comforting his friends through philosophy. One of the characters says, Plato's not here. Plato's not here. But there is no character Plato in any of the 35 dialogues who says anything. So he never wrote a word in his own name. In all of those dialogues, Plato is nowhere and Plato is everywhere. In another of them, the Phaedrus, one of the most beautiful works of literature in the West ever written, we're told that Socrates and his companion, as they leave the city and they go and take cover in the midday sun under a tree, hupotou Platonos, underneath the Plato tree. The Platonos, the Plato tree, was a big sort of plane tree that were common in the groves around Athens. It's a little joke. So Plato's not in the dialogue, but the whole dialogue happens under his artistry. One of the few ancient biographies we have of Plato describes him as growing up as a teenager wanting to be the next Sophocles, the next Euripides, the next Aeschylus, a tragedian. He wanted to write tragedies that would win the first prize at the annual Festival of the Dionysia. And the day he met Socrates, he abandoned that ambition. And Diogenes Laertius tells us that he went back that evening and burnt all of his drafts, burnt all of his tragedies. because he had met the man that he was going to devote the rest of his life to. Now, we don't know how fanciful that is. It's very difficult to work out how accurate that biography is. There's good reason for thinking that a lot of it is quite accurate. But it tells us a deep truth about Plato. It tells us that there was something that was very plausible to suggest that anecdote about a figure like that, because he is one of the greatest writers that the West has ever produced. His Greek is superb. It's particularly the middle dialogues, the Phaedrus and the Phaedo and the Republic and the Symposium. These are written in a quite extraordinary way. The extraordinary fluency and attention to detail and literary skill, development of character, dramatic energy and pathos. It's very strange to read philosophy that is in a way that you are moved by it. You are moved by what's happening. You're moved by the give and take. There's a moment at the end of one of the dialogues, the Symposium, a big drinking party, which ends with all of them effectively passed out from too much alcohol. And the sun is coming up, and there's one, apart from Socrates, there's one person just still conscious. And Socrates, as clear as a bell, completely sober, gently trying to persuade this man that one and the same person could write tragedy and comedy. Unthinkable in Athens. Two different competitions. You either became a tragedian or you became a satirist. Socrates says no. One and the same person can do both. And in the figure of Plato, we have high comedy and extraordinary pathos, poignancy, and tragedy. And part of what Plato later argues is that poets, dramatists, tragedians, comedians, satirists can be a real problem within the state. And that poetry and drama and art must be anchored to clear thinking, to clear reasoning. And Plato exemplifies that, Plato embodies that, and as it were, performs that truth in his literary artistry and in his power. So anyway, back to the original thought, the original question. Which Plato? You can start to see how hard that question is. Plato is nowhere and Plato is everywhere. Which character? Is he Socrates? Socrates is in almost all of the dialogues, except one. Most of the time he wins. Sometimes he loses. In one of the dialogues, the Parmenides, probably written towards the end of Plato's life, Plato's biggest theory, or his biggest idea, the theory of ideas, we'll talk about that in lecture 3, is given a kind of a level of scrutiny that means by the end of the dialogue you think, why did Plato take that theory seriously at all? Socrates is defeated. Socrates loses defending the position that Plato is today still most associated with. And I want to suggest that that capacity for self-criticism is also part of Plato's genius. He was willing to expose his own ideas to the cold light of the most sophisticated criticism he could find. His great the great figure of Parmenides, one of the great sophists, defeats Socrates trying to defend Plato's greatest scheme, greatest idea. There's a lesson in that. As you all embark on the journey of philosophy, as you all embark on thinking about the nature of reality, what it is to come to know the real, to see it, to perceive it, to understand it, and to live your own life within it. That thought, you might be wrong. I might be wrong. And I'm not going to know if I'm wrong if I don't continually expose the beliefs that I think are right to criticism and to scrutiny. One of Dr. Peterson's great achievements, of course, in contemporary culture has been to argue insistently, relentlessly, for the importance of freedom of conscience and freedom of speech. Because if we don't have that, as Plato understood and as Socrates understood, we'll never get to the truth. We'll never get to what's real. Because the chances are we might be wrong. You know, it's possible. Even if you think you're not, you might be wrong, but we're never going to know if we're wrong if we haven't exposed our beliefs to scrutiny and if we're not willing to engage in self-criticism. And also, it's very likely that some of our beliefs are right and some of them are wrong, and we're never going to know which ones are right and which ones are wrong if we, again, haven't put that through the kind of Socratic dialectic and scrutiny that we're going to be talking about in the next lecture. And finally, and this is a phrase from the great John Stuart Mill in his second chapter of On Liberty, 1859, he who knows only his own side knows little of that. He who knows only his own side knows little of that. As we'll see, the genius of the dialogue form that Plato chooses as the vehicle for his philosophy is that it gives us confidence as we follow Socrates. It gives us confidence that he is able to sift through and defend his positions, that he understands them because he's willing to expose them to the sharpest criticism. Every single character advances a different perspective. Nobody, therefore, can know only their own side. Once you know all of the sides, you understand your own. It's the only way you're going to understand your own side. Well, that concludes the first lecture. And since we've been talking about dialogue and the importance of dialogue in philosophy, I think it's time we open things up for dialogue, for questions, for thoughts, reflections. Gentlemen over there.
So, since sophists were huge advocates for relativism, sophists have ever come to be without Greece first being in a postmodern age? And if not, then would our association of truth with sophists right now be different, which by extension affects how we view truth in today's age?
Thank you. So the question there is, do we see in the contemporary world, across the contemporary landscape of intellectuals, sophistic types of reasoning, patterns of reasoning? And does that destabilize a sense that there's a capital T truth? Is that the question?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think that's right. And one of the interesting, just to flesh that out a little bit, I'd say that it's good for us all to think about philosophy as distinct from, say, something like the natural sciences. So the natural sciences make progress. It's a body of knowledge that is growing and sometimes shrinking as we ditch certain parts of it. And we can, as it were, we can make progress. We can say that scientifically we know far more about the world than we did 2,500 years ago. One of the most wonderful and frustrating features of philosophy is that it's not like that. It's frustrating to be engaged in something that you can't make progress in. You can't just say, right, we've settled that argument. God does exist. Or we've settled this argument. This is what knowledge is. Can't do that. Philosophy doesn't traffic in scientific truths or mathematical truths or proofs. There are no proofs in philosophy. I think it was Cicero and Descartes as well said something similar. There is no idea in the whole history of human thought that isn't so crazy that some philosopher somewhere hasn't been willing to defend it. So back to your question. Relativism is with us today, and sophistry is with us today, and the sophistic figures are with us today, just as they were in 5th century Athens. Because there's no way in the end to disprove them. When you say to the relativist, relativism is false. But that's just your opinion, says the relativist, or that's true relative to you, but not relative to me, and so on. And you go down a rabbit hole very quickly. But in the end, there'll come a point where you're having a discussion or a dialogue with somebody, and they will simply not accept your point of view, no matter how many powerful arguments you advance. And there'll come a point where you simply need to walk away. And just walk away. There's no proof you can guide them through. And a lot of the time, philosophical positions rely on our intuitions. Now, those intuitions are shaped by our culture in all sorts of interesting ways. And this is why, another reason why it's important that we're looking at this ancient philosopher. Not because we're hunting for parallels, though I hope I've shown that there really are some parallels, both in the sophistic tradition and in the materialistic approach to reality. But also because we want to see the strangeness of other ways of thinking. Why? Because by seeing the strangeness of other ways of thinking, we understand the strangeness of our own. In the great sweep of the history of Western philosophy, the idea that we're just bits of meat Lego with no soul and we're just going to be reduced back to the material configurations of atoms from which we came is a very superstitious belief. Very superstitious. Materialism, that way of thinking, it was around in the ancient world, as I explained, but it didn't, certainly in the wake of Plato, was very much a minority position. And yet it's everywhere, it's in the air we breathe. It's not just within the philosophy departments, but it's a very common way of thinking nowadays. So that's part of why we're going back so far, just all the way to the beginning. We're thinking about origins, but we're also thinking about the strangeness of these other ways of thinking. And we'll see in lecture 3 that Plato develops a position, particularly in the Republic, but also elsewhere, that is effectively our way of thinking today upside down. The science stuff, the science knowledge, is the least stable. Not least because it's always changing. Would you be happy if your teachers at school had been giving you physics textbooks from the 1930s? our understanding of the natural, our scientific understanding of the world is changing the whole time. Would you be happy if your teachers at school were giving you Plato's dialogues? Well, I hope you would be. Certainly by the end of this series, I hope you would be. You can read those profitably. You can understand and argue with ancient thinking in this way. So, philosophy doesn't evolve in the same way as the sciences. And what that means is you can have dinner parties with the dead. I'm going to encourage you in these lectures to have dinner parties with the dead. And reading a Platonic dialogue is very like that. You're reading the symposium, you're actually at a dinner party, a drinking party, and things start to get very messy over the course of the evening, as I said earlier, because the drinking is ratcheted up a notch, and things get a lot less philosophical over time. Gentleman over there.
Professor, would you consider that today we are in a pre-Socratic epistemological age? Why?
That's an excellent question. And I would say, yes, we are to some extent in a pre-Socratic intellectual age, inasmuch as there are dominant orthodoxies that take for granted what the pre-Socratics took for granted, namely that the ultimate shopping list of reality, all the ultimate ingredients that go to make up reality are physical in some way. Now, today we just say atoms or the subatomic world. Thales would have said water molecules, Anaximenes would have said air molecules, Heraclitus would have said fire of some kind. But the point remains, right? It's ultimately a material, physical way. Metaphysics is physics. There's no meta to physics. And you're right, too, to bring in the theological dimension, in as much as I think we are, let's say that the elite intellectual culture is very uncomfortable with the idea that the divine might be real. I'm not sure that's true worldwide. In fact, I think we're seeing a resurgence of religion all across the world. But I think, as it were, within, let's say, the Western establishment, if I can use that phrase, so broad and a bit crude, but broadly speaking, there is a hostility to the idea that there might be more to reality than what science and physics tells us there is. The pre-Socratics were equally critical of those sorts of ideas. But remember, the pre-Socratics are resisting the kind of theology that Plato himself seems to have resisted. And we'll see in the next lecture how that resistance develops. Because remember that the kind of theology that is being rejected by the pre-Socratics is really a Homeric theology, a rather crude, sort of polytheistic and mythological way of thinking about divinity, an incredibly anthropomorphic way of thinking about divinity. If you read that extraordinary opening book of the Iliad, the greatest poem ever written, and that extraordinary scene at the end of the first book, when the plague, the arrows of Apollo are descending on the troops, and suddenly the scene shifts to the top of Mount Olympus, where the gods have gathered for a banquet. And the hobbling Hephaestus, the service supposed to be beautiful, but it's Hephaestus hobbling around serving the drinks. And unquenchable laughter rose up through the halls of the banqueting, up to the ceiling of the banqueting hall. That's an extraordinary moment there. And what Homer is making us understand is this contrast between the grim reality of human mortality and tragedy and death and war and suffering, and the amorality of Olympus, where the gods live forever at an eternal dinner party. And part of what we see in Plato's dialogues and in the pre-Socratics is a profound skepticism to understanding the divine in that way, and profound skepticism towards the thought that that kind of theology should be what stitches a society together.
Excuse me if I'm zooming things in a bit too much here, but at the beginning of the lecture you discussed the issue of qualified individuals in their specific fields feeling a bit too wise for their own good. Does Plato ever discuss the possibility that perhaps some of that blame lies at the feet of the people who view them as wise in encompassing not just their own field, but in general?
Yes, it's a very good question. I think towards the end of the Republic, you start to see, which, as we'll see in Lecture 5, you start to see Plato addressing this problem by saying, well, every group within society with a particular techne, with a particular skill, with a particular talent or aptitude should belong in that place. And it's got a kind of very hierarchical but also extremely sort of functional way of understanding each individual's contribution to the overall good of society. One of the criticisms he has of democracy is that it's a kind of universal acid for that way of thinking, because he thinks that democratic approaches have a kind of radical egalitarianism that makes that kind of appropriate allocation of different groups to different levels of society, depending on their specialization and depending on their skill, all but impossible. And he thinks that the trade-off for freedom that the radical democrat is willing to make is not worth it, because it leads to, in the end, he thinks, to anarchy. It's going to be a very interesting point of discussion and reflection when we come onto that in Lecture 5.
Yeah, so you were talking about how Plato was a sort of, I don't know if the word is fulcrum, but he brought a lot of things together. And obviously in the first lecture, you're going to go into the world in which Plato lived and how that influenced him. But how much of Plato was him being influenced by good thinkers, and how much of it was him being a product of his time and just having a lot of time to think? Whereas like nowadays, we're bombarded with stimulus, even as recently as the 19th century, you had these big libraries full of books, and it seemed like everything was already figured out. How much was figured out when Plato was around?
It's a great question. At one level, very little had been figured out. So if you're thinking in terms of progress in the sciences or in mathematics or even varieties of literature, it's all pretty limited. A lot of it's starting then, but still falls way short of what all those different avenues of human inquiry and achievement would later become. But at another level, what's refreshing about reading the dialogues is that you understand that all of those enormous libraries in the 19th century, 20th century, 21st century, they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. In the end, all of that knowledge does still rest on some quite straightforward and simple questions, or at least questions that are deceptively simple, because they're ultimately philosophical questions. And so one can always ask, of the axioms on which these enormous libraries have been built, books have been written, why? Ultimately, what's happening here? What is it to know this? Why pursue this? Is there a good? Is there a good in this field of inquiry? Why do this at all? Why write this book? So those sorts of philosophical questions that they're always opening up, not the bonnet, what do you call a bonnet in America? The hood. It's always, this is always about looking under the hood. And looking under the hood is, in fact, it's both an extremely difficult exercise, partly because it's extremely, the questions are so deceptively simple. And those simple questions are difficult, but they're not difficult in the sense that they need to presuppose libraries of knowledge. Thank you all very much. Looking forward to reconvening for our next lecture.